Bloodborne has been hiding things in its shadows for over a decade, and what players have reported seeing in its fog-soaked streets goes so far beyond what the game officially acknowledges that it becomes genuinely difficult to separate urban legend from something the developers may have quietly left behind. I want to be upfront with you about why I made this video. I have been deep in Bloodborne lore for years, and at some point I started noticing that the most interesting conversations were not about the bosses or the story beats that everyone already knew. They were about the things people swore they saw. The shadow at the end of a hallway that did not match any known enemy. The sound that played once and was never reproduced. The NPC that someone encountered in a location where no NPC should exist. I started collecting these accounts, cross-referencing them with what the game files actually contain, and trying to figure out which of them point towards something real and which ones are just the product of a game that is so deliberately unsettling that your brain fills in gaps on its own. One specific choice I made when assembling this video was to keep the focus on accounts that have some kind of corroboration. I excluded dozens of single-source claims with no follow-up, not because I think they are definitely false, but because the ones that have been reported by multiple players independently are the ones worth spending real time on. What you are going to hear in this video suggests that From Software built Bloodborne with more in it than they ever officially confirmed. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Hunter Who Was Already There. When you first arrive in Yharnam, the game gives you a very specific tutorial path. You drop into a room, you are bitten by a creature, and the transformation that defines the rest of the game begins. Almost every player follows the same route out of that starting area, but a small number of players have reported something that should not be there on that initial path. A hunter. Not an enemy hunter, not a white phantom, not anything with a health bar. Just a figure standing at the far end of a corridor that disappears the moment you get close enough to see it clearly. Multiple players on separate forums have described the same basic shape. Tall, in a hunter's garb, standing still, gone before you reach it. The accounts started appearing not long after the game launched in 2015. At first they were dismissed as new players, being confused by the game's notoriously dark visual style. Bloodborne does not give you great lighting in those early corridors, and the creature designs are deliberately built to confuse your spatial reasoning, so a standing figure in the dark could easily be a piece of environmental detail that looks vaguely humanoid. That was the easy explanation, and for a while it held. The problem is that the accounts kept coming, and they started getting more specific. Players were not just saying they saw a figure, they were saying the figure was oriented toward them. Not facing a wall, not standing in a corner. Facing outward, as if looking at the approaching player. That detail is harder to explain away as a texture or a prop, because props in that corridor do not face inward. One particularly detailed account came from a player who said they had done a fresh run specifically to test the claim after reading about it. They moved slowly through the starting area, checked every corner, and when they reached the specific corridor in question, they saw the figure. They tried to approach it and it was gone before they closed half the distance. They described it as not fading out, but simply no longer being there between one frame and the next. Now, one possible reading of this is that it is a rendering artifact. Bloodborne runs on hardware that was already being pushed at launch, and there are documented cases of geometry and shadow rendering behaving strangely in specific corridors. A tall shadow in the right configuration could conceivably resolve into something that looks like a standing person. That explanation is plausible, and it is probably the correct one for some percentage of these reports. But it does not fully account for the orientation detail. Shadows from environmental sources do not typically face the player, and enough people have described the figure as specifically oriented toward them that it starts to feel like either a very consistent hallucination or something that actually has facing data attached to it. Some players who have dug into the game files have noted that the starting area contains remnant data from development builds that did not make it into the final game. From Software is known for leaving cut content in their game files, not always cleanly removed. There are enemy types in Bloodborne's data that never appear in the final game. There are NPC entries with dialogue lines attached to them that are never triggered. The possibility that a non-hostile, non-interactive character was placed in the starting corridor during development and then removed at the behavior level, but not the visual level, is not outrageous. What makes this specific sighting more interesting is that it lines up with something in the lore. The game's opening cinematic and the various notes you find early in Yharnam suggest that the hunter you're playing as is not the first person to make this particular journey. Other hunters came before. The doll in the hunter's dream references hunters in a way that implies continuity across many hunts. So the idea that the game might have originally included some kind of echo or remnant of a prior hunter in that starting corridor is not thematically inconsistent. The figure has been given different names by different communities. Some call it the prior hunter, some just refer to it as the starting apparition. The name does not matter much. What matters is that enough people have seen something in that corridor that it has become one of the more reliably reported anomalies in the entire game's history. The variation in accounts is also worth noting. Most of the reports place the figure in the same general location, but a handful of players describe seeing something similar in the adjacent room, closer to where you first pick up your starting weapon. If this were a pure rendering artifact, you would expect it to appear in exactly the same spot every time, based on the same geometry. The fact that there is some variation in location could mean different things. It could mean that different players are seeing different artifacts and grouping them together under the same label. Or it could mean that whatever this thing is, it has some limited range of positioning. There is also a subset of accounts that claim the figure appears specifically on NG+ cycles rather than on first playthroughs. If that is accurate, it would suggest the appearance is tied to a game state variable rather than being a random visual glitch. That is a more interesting possibility, because it would mean the game is doing something intentional. Whether that intention was designed in, or is an emergent behavior from how save data interacts with the starting area's initialization, is a separate question. The honest assessment here is that we do not have definitive proof of anything. No one has produced footage that unambiguously shows a standing figure with facing data in that corridor. What we have is a consistent cluster of player reports that describe the same basic thing, some corroborating detail from the game files about leftover development content, and a thematic framework from the lore that makes the idea coherent. That is more than most rumours in this game can offer, and it is enough to take seriously. A few players have reported that the figure appears to be holding something. One account described it as having a weapon at its side, which would be consistent with hunter-enemy models. Another described it as holding something larger, more like the trick weapons that bosses carry. These details conflict with each other enough that they are probably not reliable as specifics, but they consistently agree on the figure having an arm extended in a way that suggests it is carrying something. Some people have tried to connect this to the game's insight mechanic. In Bloodborne, your insight stat literally changes what you can perceive. At 0 insight, you cannot see certain enemies at all. At higher insight, additional enemies appear, ambient sounds change, and the world becomes measurably more hostile. The suggestion is that the starting figure might be tied to a specific insight level, visible only within a narrow window that most players pass through quickly without paying attention to that particular corridor. The insight connection is appealing because it fits the game's design philosophy. Bloodborne explicitly built a system around the idea that perception itself is unreliable, and that seeing more is not necessarily seeing correctly. A figure that appears only at certain insight levels would be entirely consistent with how the game handles other optional perceptions. The problem is that no one has been able to reliably reproduce the sighting by controlling their insight level at the time. Players with 0 insight have reported it. Players with 10 insight have reported it. The insight correlation has not held up to testing. That leaves us back at the most mundane explanation, which is visual artifact, or the most interesting one, which is a non-interactive, non-hostile entity that exists in the starting corridor for reasons the game never explains. Given everything Bloodborne is willing to leave unexplained, the second option is not as far-fetched as it would sound in almost any other game. There is one more detail worth mentioning. A small number of players who claim to have seen the figure also described a subsequent change in the game's behaviour. They reported that enemies in the starting area seemed more aggressive than normal, or that item placements were slightly different than what they expected based on prior runs. These claims are extremely hard to verify and probably fall into the category of the human brain, constructing a narrative after an unusual experience. But the consistency with which players associate the sighting with some kind of change is worth flagging, even if only as a curiosity. The starting area of Bloodborne is supposed to be the safest part of the game. It is designed to ease players into the mechanics before the world opens up and becomes genuinely dangerous. The idea that there is something watching you from the very beginning, something that the game never acknowledges and never explains, fits the thematic intent of Bloodborne better than almost any explicit piece of lore. From Software has always been interested in the feeling of being observed by things you cannot fully perceive. Whether they built that feeling into the starting corridor deliberately, or whether players have constructed it from shadows and noise, the result is the same. Something is there, or something suggests it should be. The prior hunter, if we accept that label, represents something important about how Bloodborne operates as an experience. It is a game that rewards paranoia. It is a game that tells you repeatedly, through its systems and its story, that what you think you see and what is actually there are not always the same thing. A figure that appears at the beginning and then never reappears, that cannot be caught or interacted with, that may or may not be in the files, is almost too perfect a fit for that design intent. Whether it is real or imagined, it is exactly what Bloodborne would put there if it wanted to set a tone. And honestly, that ambiguity might be intentional. From Software does not explain the moon presence in plain language. They do not tell you what the doll is. They leave the choir's experiments in a state of deliberate incompleteness. The studio is comfortable with things that suggest rather than confirm, and the starting figure sits perfectly in that tradition. It is a rumour that the game itself seems designed to support. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: multiple players across multiple years have reported the same general phenomenon in the same general location. The game files contain content that was placed there during development and not fully removed. The lore supports the idea of prior hunters leaving traces, and the game's own systems are built around the idea that perception is conditional and unreliable. Put all of that together, and you have something that is more than a simple ghost story. You have a rumour that the architecture of the game itself seems to have left room for. Whether you've seen it yourself, or whether this is the first you're hearing of it, the starting corridor of Yharnam is worth revisiting with this in mind. Slow down. Let your insight sit in a specific range. Move through that first hallway carefully. The worst thing that happens is you see nothing and you have a slightly more paranoid start to your run. The other possibility is that you see what dozens of other players have seen: a figure, standing there, already watching. The discussion around this sighting has never fully resolved. New threads pop up every few months, with someone reporting the same thing for the first time, having no prior knowledge of the existing accounts. That independent rediscovery is what keeps this rumour alive. It is not a story that gets passed around and embellished. It is a story that keeps being found from scratch. And that matters, because it means the source is either the game itself or something consistent enough in human perception to generate the same report repeatedly. Neither of those possibilities is entirely comfortable. Chapter 2. The Choir Singer in the Upper Cathedral Ward. The Upper Cathedral Ward is one of the most deliberately oppressive areas in Bloodborne. The enemies there, the celestial emissaries and the winter lanterns, are designed to make you feel like your sanity is the resource being depleted rather than your health. The ambient audio in that area is uncomfortable in a specific way that is hard to describe but easy to recognize. It sits at a frequency that suggests something just outside your ability to process it clearly. And within that audio environment, multiple players have reported hearing something that is not in the game's listed soundtrack. A voice, singing, not humming, not ambient vocalizations. Actual singing with what players describe as a melodic structure, though no one has been able to reproduce it consistently enough to transcribe it. The accounts cluster around a specific part of the Upper Cathedral Ward, in the indoor areas before you reach the boss room. Players describe it as coming from above, from a direction that does not correspond to any accessible area of the level geometry. The first time this got serious attention was when two players who did not know each other posted descriptions of the same experience within a week of each other on separate forums. The descriptions matched closely enough that other players took notice. Both described a female voice. Both described it as coming from above. Both described it stopping when they progressed to a certain point in the area. The timing of the cessation is the detail that made other players sit up, because if it were environmental audio bleed from another game or an external source, it would not be likely to stop at a consistent in-game location. The choir is a faction in Bloodborne's lore that is worth understanding here. They are connected to the Healing Church, and they occupy the Upper Cathedral Ward. Their work involves what the game describes as contact with the eldritch beings that the Church has been chasing, the great ones that exist beyond normal human perception. The choir's methods are extreme. They use living subjects in their experiments. They are trying to open a channel to something that is, by definition, not meant to be communicated with through normal means. The sound of singing in their territory is thematically loaded in a way that cannot be ignored. Item descriptions in the Upper Cathedral Ward suggest that the choir did not simply study eldritch beings, they believed communion with them was possible through the right kind of resonance. The great ones in Bloodborne are often connected to sound and frequency in ways that the text hints at but never fully explains. A choir in this context is not just a group that sings, it is a group that uses coordinated sound as a mechanism for contact. So the sound of singing in this space is not a benign ambient detail, it carries the weight of everything the choir was trying to do there. Several players who reported the singing also described a feeling of increased dread during the experience that went beyond the normal atmospheric tension of the area. One account mentioned that the winter lanterns in the area behaved differently during the singing, approaching more slowly than usual, as if something else had their attention. This is an extremely difficult claim to verify, and enemy behaviour in Bloodborne has enough variance that slight differences in aggression could easily be noise in the data. But the claim recurs in multiple accounts. There is a technical possibility that deserves attention here. Bloodborne's audio system layers ambient tracks in ways that can produce emergent sound combinations not present in any single audio file. The specific combination of tracks active in the Upper Cathedral Ward creates an unusually complex acoustic environment. It is possible that specific hardware configurations, specific audio settings, or even specific playback timing creates an emergent combination that resolves into something that sounds like a melodic voice. This would not be intentional, but it would be reproducible under the right conditions, which might explain why the reports cluster but cannot be reliably triggered. The game's audio director Tsukasa Saito composed a score for Bloodborne that is widely recognized as one of the most sophisticated in the medium. The choir elements in that score are extensive and technically ambitious. The game does actually contain choral vocals in its licensed music. The possibility that some of those elements bleed into non-boss areas under specific conditions is not impossible, but the accounts specifically describe the sound as coming from a location within the level geometry, not as a general atmospheric layer, and that spatial specificity is harder to explain with audio bleed. One detail that appears in a subset of accounts involves the duration of the singing. Players consistently describe it as lasting for a specific amount of time before fading rather than cutting. Cutting would suggest a triggered audio file ending. Fading suggests either a volume ramp down or a natural conclusion to a looping piece. If it is the latter, the loop length could potentially be identified by timing the duration across multiple reports. A few players have attempted this and come up with varying durations, which either means the loop length varies or that different players are measuring from different start points. The question of whether From Software deliberately placed an audio element in the upper cathedral ward that is not reliably triggered, not connected to any listed audio file, and not acknowledged anywhere in the game's design documents is a genuinely interesting one. Their design philosophy across the entire Soulsborne series suggests a willingness to leave things in the game that most players will never find. The Bloodborne files specifically contain audio assets that are never triggered in normal play. Whether any of those assets correspond to what players are describing as the choir singer is something that would require a very specific and time-consuming audit of the audio data. What makes this rumour particularly persistent is that it connects to something that is definitely in the game. The choir exists. Their work is documented in item descriptions. The upper cathedral ward is their territory. A singing voice in that space is not random. It is specific to a faction whose entire purpose involves using sound as a means of contact. If From Software wanted to leave a trace of the choir's work in that space, a faint, barely perceptible singing that most players would never notice would be exactly the kind of subtle environmental detail they would use. The Soulsborne series is full of these. An invisible enemy that attacks in the ringed city. A message that you can only see if you stand in a specific spot. An NPC that appears only after you complete a sequence no guide tells you about. The singing in the upper cathedral ward may be one of those things. It may be the game acknowledging, quietly and without explanation, that what the choir was doing in those rooms left something behind. A resonance, a frequency that the experiment generated and that never fully dissipated. That is a lore-coherent explanation, and it is also deeply unsettling, which means it fits Bloodborne perfectly. Or it may be an audio artifact, or a combination of tracks resolving into something unintended, or a handful of players hearing something external and misattributing our it. Any of these is possible. The evidence does not point exclusively in one direction, but the accounts keep coming. Players who have never heard of the rumour finish the upper cathedral ward and then go looking online to see if anyone else noticed the singing. They find these threads. They add their own experience. The pool of independent first-person reports grows. And unlike a lot of Bloodborne rumours that concentrate in specific communities and get amplified by repetition, this one seems to propagate mostly through independent discovery. Someone hears it, cannot explain it, searches for an explanation, and finds a community of people who heard the same thing. That pattern of independent discovery is the most compelling argument for taking this seriously. It does not prove that there is a deliberately placed audio element in the upper cathedral ward, but it does suggest that something in that space is generating a consistent auditory experience across different players with different hardware and different audio setups. Whatever that something is, it is not nothing. The choir wanted to make contact. That is what the lore says. They built an entire apparatus of experimentation around the idea that the boundary between human perception and something beyond it could be breached through the right kind of sound. The upper cathedral ward is where that work happened. If even a small part of what they were attempting left a mark on the space itself, the way it might appear in a Bloodborne context would be exactly this: a sound that most people do not notice, that cannot be reliably triggered, that suggests rather than confirms, and that, once heard, is difficult to classify as anything other than what it sounds like: someone or something singing. And the specific location where players report the singing fading suggests it is connected to a trigger point in the level. When you cross a certain threshold, it stops. That is not consistent with environmental audio bleed, which would not respond to player position in that way. It is consistent with an audio trigger tied to a location, even if that trigger does not correspond to any documented game event. There is no definitive conclusion here. There is a consistent pattern of reports, a thematically coherent framework for why the sound would exist in that space, a technical architecture that could plausibly produce it, either intentionally or accidentally, and an absence of any official explanation. That is the state of this rumour. Take from it what you will. But if you are playing through the upper cathedral ward, and you hear something from above that you cannot place, you are not the first person it has happened to. Chapter 3. The Thing in the Fishing Hamlet. The fishing hamlet exists at the far end of the Old Hunters DLC, and even within a game that specialises in oppressive atmosphere, it stands out. The village is built on a coastline where something terrible happened a long time ago. The fishing people who lived there encountered something in the water that changed them, and the game suggests, without quite confirming, that the change was connected to the same cosmic entities that the rest of the game orbits around. The hamlet is where the hunter Maria committed an atrocity that she spent the rest of her existence trying to forget. It is a place saturated with historical violence and with the residual presence of whatever came out of the sea. Players who spend extended time in the fishing hamlet have reported encounters that do not match any documented enemy or event. The most common of these involves the water. The hamlet has several areas where the ocean is visible, and in a handful of accounts, players have reported seeing something in the water that moves. Not the surface of the water moving in a wave pattern, which the game's rendering produces naturally. Something beneath the surface, a shape, large enough to be noticed, not large enough to be clearly identified before it is gone. The fishing hamlet exists specifically because there was something in the water. The lore makes this clear. The villagers found it, or it found them, and the interaction was transformative in ways that the game portrays through the villagers' corrupted forms. Whatever was in the water is, by the game's own account, real and significant. So the question is not whether something was there. The question is whether the game ever shows it. The official content of the hamlet does not include an underwater entity as a visible or interactable element. The water is environmental, not interactive. There are no enemies that emerge from the water in the way that the lore suggests something should. This gap between what the lore implies and what the game shows has been noted by lore analysts for years. The hamlet seems to be telling a story about an encounter with something vast, and then declining to show you that something. Players who report seeing movement in the water describe it differently. Some say it looks like a tendril or appendage. Some describe it as a mass with no clear edges. One account describes a shape that resolves briefly into something with visible structure before submerging. None of these descriptions match any enemy in the game, including the ones that have tentacular or cosmic forms. The shapes being described are, by the accounts, larger than any enemy model in the game. One interpretation is that this is environmental rendering producing shapes in the water's surface that look like movement beneath it. Water rendering in games often creates visual artifacts that read as subsurface motion when they are actually surface effects. This is a legitimate explanation, and probably accounts for some percentage of the reports. But a subset of accounts includes details that are harder to explain this way. Several players describe the shape as responding to the player's position, moving in a direction that correlates with where the player is standing on the shore. Environmental rendering artifacts do not respond to player position in that way. If a shape in the water consistently turns toward or moves toward the player's location, it has some kind of positional awareness, which means it is either an entity with AI or a very specific rendering coincidence. The fishing hamlet is also the location of one of the game's most hidden and unusual items, the accursed brew, and several other items that suggest the full history of what happened there goes deeper than even the DLC's fairly extensive lore reveals. From Software built the hamlet with a density of implication that exceeds its actual content. There is more suggested than shown, which is their standard approach, but in the hamlet, the gap feels unusually wide. The lore implications around Kos, the entity connected to the hamlet, suggest a being of enormous scale. The Orphan of Kos, which is the DLC's final boss, emerges from the corpse of Kos on the shoreline. The corpse is large. What the living version of that being would have looked like, moving in the water of the hamlet, would be something far beyond any enemy in the game. The accounts of something large beneath the surface of the hamlet's water map onto this idea in a way that is thematically coherent, even if it cannot be confirmed. There is a documented case of a player recording footage of the water in the fishing hamlet during an extended session and identifying what they claimed was a moving shape beneath the surface. The footage was analysed by other players, and the conclusion was mixed. Some saw the shape, others identified it as a specific type of water rendering artifact related to the reflection calculations the game performs. The footage was not definitive in either direction, which is frustrating but also typical for this category of evidence. What the fishing hamlet seems to do, whether intentionally or not, is create a context in which the player's imagination is primed to fill in a specific gap. The lore tells you something was in the water. The environment shows you water. Your brain constructs what belongs there. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, and it applies here. The question is whether From Software deliberately exploited it, leaving the water empty but the context full, or whether some players are seeing actual content that was either placed intentionally or generated by the engine's behaviour. Either possibility is interesting in the context of Bloodborne's design intent, a game that is fundamentally about the danger of seeing too much and about the things that exist at the edge of perception, using the gap between lore and content to create the sensation of an encounter with something that cannot be fully perceived is not an accidental design choice. It is too precise. The hamlet tells you what is in the water. It does not show you, and your mind, shaped by hours of Bloodborne's particular atmosphere, produces its own version of the thing that should be there. Whether that produced version matches what some players are reporting, and whether what those players are reporting is an actual in-game entity versus a constructed perception, is the question that this rumour cannot definitively answer, but it is the right question to be asking about a game that built its entire mechanical and narrative architecture around the idea that there are things you cannot fully see and that seeing them would break you. The fishing hamlet is the point in the game where the history of everything that led to the night of the hunt is most nakedly visible. It is where the original contact happened. It is where the wound in the world's cosmology, if you follow the law's logic, opened. And it is a place that, according to a persistent cluster of player accounts, still contains something that moves in the water and occasionally lets itself be seen. Maybe that is the game working exactly as intended, or maybe something in those files is doing what it was always going to do. Chapter 4. The Room That Opens. Once Bloodborne is a dense game. Even players who have completed it multiple times continue to find rooms, corridors, and items they missed on previous runs. The architecture of Yharnam is built to reward exploration and to make you feel like you may have missed something, no matter how thoroughly you searched. But there is a category of report that is distinct from simply discovering an overlooked area. It involves rooms that players claim to have found open on one occasion and then permanently closed or absent on every subsequent visit. The most discussed of these is a location in the Forbidden Woods. The Forbidden Woods is already one of the game's more labyrinthine areas, with a branching structure that many players navigate incompletely on multiple runs. It is the kind of place where it is genuinely possible to miss significant chunks on repeated playthroughs. But the specific room that gets reported is not described as a hidden corner. It is described as a substantial space, large enough to be noticeable, that was open and accessible during one run and then simply was not there afterward. The accounts describe the room as having contents. Several players mention a body on the floor with an item, which is a standard Bloodborne environmental storytelling element. One account describes a doorway that led to a space with multiple enemies of a type the player did not recognize. Another describes a room that was empty, except for writing on the walls, which is unusual because Bloodborne's environmental text is typically found on notes rather than inscribed on surfaces. The problem with all of these accounts is obvious. The Forbidden Woods' complexity makes misremembering location details extremely easy. A player who found a hidden room in one area might be misremembering its exact position on a subsequent run, concluding that the room is gone when in fact they are looking in a slightly wrong location. This is the most straightforward explanation, and it probably accounts for most of these reports. But the subset of accounts that include specific enough spatial descriptions to be tested is more interesting. A few players have described the room's location in terms that are precise enough that other players have gone to look for it. In some cases, those other players have reported finding a wall where the room should be. In other cases, they report finding exactly what was described, suggesting that the original player simply missed it on return visits. The data is not clean enough to point in a single direction. There is a documented phenomenon in Bloodborne where certain doors and passages have state-dependent behavior that is not fully explained to the player. Some doors only open after specific triggers that many players complete without registering them as meaningful actions. Some passages open and close based on variables that are not directly communicated. The game is full of this kind of undocumented state-dependent geometry, and it is possible that the reported room exists in this category, accessible only under conditions that the game never tells you about. The lore context for the Forbidden Woods is relevant here. The woods were used by the Healing Church for experiments they did not want conducted in the city proper. The deeper you go into the woods, the more evidence you find of what those experiments involved. The area is designed to suggest that things were done there that were meant to stay hidden. A room that opens under specific conditions and then closes again is entirely consistent with a space that was deliberately concealed and that the game is deciding, based on some variable, whether to show you. Several players have tried to identify the trigger condition for the room's appearance. The theories include having a specific item in your inventory, having a specific level of insight, having completed a specific NPC questline, and having killed enemies in a specific order in the area. None of these has been confirmed, partly because no one has managed to reliably reproduce the room's appearance in the first place. You cannot identify a trigger condition for something you cannot consistently find. The most unusual account in this category comes from a player who claims the room appeared on their second playthrough but not their first. And when they returned to the second playthrough save file, the room was still there, still accessible, still containing the same items. They describe it as being integrated into the game world on that save file in a way that felt permanent rather than transient. If accurate, this would suggest that the room's appearance is tied to save data variables rather than to real-time triggers, which would be a different kind of state-dependent behavior, one connected to what has already happened in the player's history rather than what is happening in the current session. The writing on the walls account is worth revisiting here. Bloodborne uses inscriptions in specific, deliberate ways. The words you find on notes and environmental text are carefully chosen and almost never random. A room with writing on the walls that does not appear in any documented version of the Forbidden Woods would be a significant discovery, not just a curiosity. If that writing contained lore-relevant content that has not been seen in the final game, it would suggest a room that was developed to a meaningful degree and then either disabled or made conditional in a way that makes it very rarely accessible. The game files for Bloodborne contain room and geometry data for spaces that do not appear in the final game. Some of these are clearly cut content, replaced by or merged with other areas, but some are more ambiguous, present in the files and not obviously removed, just not consistently accessible through normal play. Whether any of these correspond to the reported room in the Forbidden Woods would require a specific kind of file analysis that has not been systematically applied to this question. What keeps this rumour alive is that the Forbidden Woods is genuinely the kind of place where a room could hide. The area's geometry is complex, its branching is non-linear, and even experienced players acknowledge that they have found new things in it after many playthroughs. The line between a room that has always been there and a room that only appears under specific conditions is, in that context, harder to draw than it would be in a more linear game. The possibility that From Software built a conditional space in the Forbidden Woods, one that opens based on criteria the game never explains and closes just as silently, fits their design ethos perfectly. They have done similar things in other games. The Soulsborne series is full of secrets that require extremely specific conditions to uncover, conditions that the game does not telegraph and that players often find by accident. A room that is only accessible once, or only under conditions no one has yet identified, would be unusual but not unprecedented. What you should take from this is not that the room definitely exists in the way it has been described. The evidence is too fragmented and the environment too prone to misremembering for that conclusion. What you should take from it is that Bloodborne is almost certainly not fully mapped by anyone, and that the Forbidden Woods in particular seems to have more in it than even extensive play has fully uncovered. That is not a ghost story. That is a reasonable inference from what we know about how the game was built and what the files contain. The room may be there. You may just not have been there on the right night. Chapter 5. The Doll's Second Voice. The doll in the Hunter's Dream is one of Bloodborne's most discussed characters, not just for her narrative significance, but for the quality of her voice performance and the specific texture of what she says. Her dialogue is among the most carefully written in the game, and players have analysed it extensively for lore implications. But a small and persistent group of players report having heard dialogue from the doll that does not appear in any documented transcript of her lines. Dialogue that they describe as different in tone and content from everything officially attributed to her. The most common version of this claim involves players hearing the doll speak when they enter the dream without interacting with her. The standard behaviour is that the doll speaks when you walk up to her or when you trigger specific dialogue events. She does not typically speak unprompted when you simply enter the area, but several players describe arriving in the Hunter's Dream, walking past the doll, and hearing a line of dialogue that was not triggered by any interaction and that they were unable to reproduce. The content of these unreproducible lines varies across accounts, but there are themes that appear more than once. Several players describe hearing something that sounded like a warning. Not the usual gentle, melancholic quality of the doll's standard lines, but something more urgent in tone. A few accounts describe a line that referenced the player character directly, using language that felt more aware of the metafictional dimension of the game than the doll's standard dialogue. The doll's role in the game's lore is worth unpacking here. She was made by Gehrman in the image of a woman named Lady Maria, who is a significant figure in the game's history. The doll is not alive in a conventional sense. She is animated by the dream, which means her existence is contingent on the dream's continuation. She is deeply connected to whatever force is maintaining the hunter's dream, which the game eventually reveals to be the moon presence. What she knows and what she's allowed to say may not be the same thing. The game hints at the possibility that the doll understands more about the hunter's situation than her standard dialogue suggests. A few players have approached this claim from a technical angle. They have recorded audio from extended sessions in the hunter's dream, logging every visit over multiple playthroughs, attempting to catch an unreproducible line. No one has produced footage containing a line that is clearly not in the documented transcript. This is meaningful, but not conclusive. If the trigger for these lines is rare and specific enough, extended recording sessions might still miss it. And the absence of recorded evidence does not rule out that players are having genuine auditory experiences that the game is producing, whether intentionally or not. The voice actress for the doll, Iveta Motta, gave a performance that is widely considered exceptional, with a layered quality that gives her lines different meaning depending on context and playthrough stage. It is possible that some players are hearing known lines in a different context than expected and interpreting them as new lines because the meaning reads differently in that moment. This is a psychologically plausible explanation, and it probably accounts for some of the reports, but it does not explain the accounts where players describe specific content that does not appear in the documented line set. There is a category of Bloodborne audio that involves what are sometimes called placeholder lines, dialogue recorded during development for testing purposes that was never meant to appear in the final game, but was not always cleanly removed from the audio files. The game has been known to occasionally trigger these in unusual circumstances. If the doll has placeholder or development stage lines in her audio files, they could potentially be triggered under conditions that were not intended and that have never been reliably reproduced. The lore framing around the dream suggests that it is not a stable space. It is maintained by an entity that has its own agenda, and the doll is part of its structure. The game leaves open the possibility that the dream is not simply a neutral hub, but an active space that is doing something to the hunter over the course of the hunt. In that context, the doll speaking in ways that break from her established pattern would be significant. It would suggest that the dream is not as controlled or as stable as it appears, that things slip through that were not meant to. What makes this rumour particularly compelling is that it sits at the intersection of the game's most intimate character relationship and its most unsettling philosophical implications. The doll is the hunter's only consistent point of connection across the entire game. She is the one constant in a world that is deteriorating. If she is capable of saying things she has not been heard to say before, things that feel different in tone and content from her established voice, then the stability of that relationship is in question. And in a game built around the collapse of stable meaning, that is a perfect place to plant a mystery. The second voice, if it exists, suggests that the doll has more information than she is sharing, or that something is using her as a channel, or that the dream itself is communicating through her. Any of these possibilities is interesting. Any of them is consistent with what the game tells us about how the dream works and what the moon presence is capable of. The game never closes off these interpretive directions. It leaves them deliberately open. Chapter 6. The Unseen Watcher in Yharnam. Yharnam, the unseen village, earns its name. It is a place designed around the feeling of surveillance, of being watched by things that are not visible. The snatcher enemies that drag you there are already a signal of what the area is about. You are taken somewhere you did not choose to go, by something that wanted you there, for reasons that the game reveals slowly and unsettlingly. The area is associated with the School of Mensis, a faction of scholars who push the boundaries of the same research the rest of the game documents, and who crossed a line that left most of them in a state that cannot be described as living. The specific rumour associated with Yharnam involves the sound of breathing. Players in specific parts of the area, particularly in the interior sections of the village, before you reach the Mensis cage, describe hearing breathing that does not correspond to any enemy in the area, not ambient sound, not their own characters' exertion audio, actual rhythmic, deep breathing from a location they cannot identify, coming from a direction that does not have a visible source. The breathing is described as slow. Multiple accounts use words like deliberate or heavy. One account describes it as seeming to come from directly behind the player, regardless of which direction the player is facing. That last detail is unusual enough to be worth examining separately. Sound that appears to come from directly behind you and maintains that orientation as you turn is either an omnidirectional audio source placed at the player's position or something with positional awareness. Neither of those is a common game behaviour outside of intentional design. Yharnam's enemy population includes the Bell Maidens, who control enemy density in the area, and the choir adjacent enemies deeper in. But the breathing is reported in areas before those enemies are active, in spaces that should contain only specific documented enemies with known audio profiles. The documented enemies in those areas do not produce the described audio. The school of Mensis used the Mensis ritual to attempt contact with the Great Ones, through a method involving a vast number of human minds working in concert. The ritual went wrong or right, depending on how you define success in that context, and the scholars were left as empty vessels, their higher functions stripped away, their bodies animated but vacant. The great cage that dominates Yharnam is part of the ritual apparatus, and the entity that the ritual successfully contacted, Mergo, is a Great One's child, whose cry is the most distinctive audio in the game's final section. In this context, a slow and deliberate breathing in the spaces around Mensis is not random. Breathing in that lore space means something is present, something with a body large enough to produce the sound that players are describing. The breathing of a Great One, or something adjacent to one, would by the game's own logic be something that operates at a scale different from human scale. Large, slow, deliberate. Some players have tested this by approaching the areas where the breathing is reported with a specific strategy of eliminating every possible enemy source before listening for the sound. The accounts from these tests are mixed. Some players complete the area without hearing anything. Others report the breathing appearing after the area has been cleared, which is an interesting detail because cleared areas typically have their ambient audio shift. If the breathing appears specifically after clearing, it is more likely tied to a specific trigger than to ambient sound. The connection to the Mensis ritual adds a layer of interpretation that is hard to ignore. The ritual was designed to attract the attention of something. If it worked even partially, then the attention it attracted would still be there. The game does not give you a clear signal about what is still present in Yharnam after the ritual has concluded. The entity Mergo is above. The scholars are empty. But what about the thing that came when they called? Is it still in the building? The game does not say. The breathing, if it is there, suggests that the building is not empty in the way it appears. That something came to Yharnam when the ritual called, and it did not leave when the hunters arrived and disrupted the proceedings. That interpretation is consistent with the game's general approach to cosmic horror, in which the things you attract through forbidden knowledge do not simply go away once the ritual is over. They are there. You may not be able to see them, but they are breathing. Chapter 7. The Abandoned Workshop's Other Occupant. The Abandoned Workshop is one of the most emotionally charged locations in Bloodborne. It is reached through a secret passage that requires a specific sequence of actions, and when you get there, what you find is a broken-down version of the hunter's dream, a physical analogue to the supernatural space you've been using throughout the game. The insight delivered by reaching it, both mechanically and narratively, is significant. You understand something about the origin of the dream and about Gehrman's history that recontextualizes everything. The room contains specific items that are important to the lore and a physical version of the doll, broken, sitting in a corner. This version of the doll is unanimously reported to be unsettling in a way that goes beyond standard Bloodborne atmospheric design. Players consistently describe her as feeling like she is about to move. The still figure of the physical doll in that broken room is one of the game's most effective environmental horror achievements. But the specific claim attached to this location is that she does move. Not dramatically, not in a way that initiates combat or triggers a scene. A small number of players report seeing the physical doll's head turn slightly or her hand shift position during the time they are in the room. Not a full animation, a micro movement, the kind of thing you might dismiss as a trick of the lighting or the game's rendering interpolating between static positions. The physical doll has no documented animation beyond her static placement in the room. She is an environmental object, not a character with a behavior tree. An environmental object should not have independent movement, micro or otherwise. If players are genuinely seeing movement, it is either a rendering artifact, an intentional Easter egg with an undiscovered trigger, or something in the game's handling of static object rendering that produces the illusion of movement under specific conditions. The accounts are not uniform. Most describe the movement as occurring in peripheral vision, which is precisely the kind of vision most susceptible to producing false movement from static objects. The human visual system is tuned to detect movement in peripheral areas with a sensitivity that does not require the movement to be real. This is a basic fact of human perception, and it applies directly here. The most parsimonious explanation for peripheral vision movement from a static object is that the movement was not there. But a small number of accounts describe the movement as occurring while the player was looking directly at the doll. One account describes the head movement as happening while the player was standing still, looking at the doll's face, specifically watching for movement after having read about the rumour. That account is either an honest report of something the game did, or it is confirmation bias at work, the brain producing what it expected to see. Distinguishing between these two possibilities from a text account alone is not possible. The lore context here is specific and important. The physical doll was made by Yharnam from a genuine human being's likeness. The doll in the dream is animated by the moon presence. The physical doll in the workshop is what the dream version was before the dream was created. Whether that original object carries any residual connection to what it became in the dream is something the game implies but does not resolve. The doll in the dream knows things. Does the physical one feel things? Does the connection between them work in both directions? The idea that the physical doll might move, however slightly, suggests that the connection to the dream version is not one-directional, that the entity the dream doll has become can, under some circumstances, animate her physical counterpart. Just a little. Just enough. Just enough to remind you that the boundary between the dream and the waking world is not as clean as the game structure implies. Whether this is a real game behaviour or a very effective piece of environmental design that primes the player's imagination, it achieves the same result. The abandoned workshop is not simply a narrative revelation. It is a place that feels alive in a specific and wrong way, and the doll in the corner is the source of that feeling, regardless of whether she ever actually moves. Chapter 8. The Sound Beneath the Cathedral. Ward. The Cathedral Ward is the hub area of Bloodborne's middle section. Players pass through it dozens of times over a complete run, using it as a transit point between other areas. Because it is so familiar, it is the kind of place where anomalies would be most reliably noticed. A sound that does not belong would stand out against the well-known acoustic environment of a space you've crossed dozens of times. The reported sound in the Cathedral Ward is described as a low resonance, almost below the threshold of hearing that some players describe as felt more than heard. It comes from below. from beneath the flagstones. And unlike the ambient audio of the area, which is carefully characterized and consistent, this resonance is described as intermittent, present on some traversals and absent on others. The cathedral ward is built on top of something. The game explicitly tells you this through its geography. The Healing Church workshop is accessible through the ward, and below the workshop are the deeper sections of the game's underground. The entire Yharnam architecture implies significant depth beneath the visible surface, and the cathedral ward sits above some of the game's most significant hidden content. Players who report the resonance consistently describe it as coming from a specific area of the ward, near the large cathedral building at its centre. The direction is always downward, and several accounts note that it is most noticeable when standing still, which would be consistent with a low-frequency vibration that is masked by footstep audio. One possible explanation is that this is audio from the game's lower levels bleeding upward through the geometry. If the game's audio calculations include sounds from areas below the current location in the load radius, low-frequency audio from those spaces might be audible in the cathedral ward under specific conditions. This is a technical possibility that would not require any special content placement. It would just be an emergent behavior of how the audio engine handles sound propagation across connected geometry. But the lore implication is more interesting. The thing beneath the cathedral ward in the game's cosmology is not just architecture. It is the site of experiments that the Healing Church conducted at the foundation of their entire project. The deep places beneath Yharnam are where the contact with the Great Ones first took root institutionally. If something still resonates from that contact, the cathedral ward, built directly above it, would be where that resonance is most likely to surface. The Great Ones in Bloodborne do not simply occupy physical space. They exist at a level of reality that intersects with the physical but is not coextensive with it. Their presence leaves traces in the places where contact was made. The resonance beneath the cathedral ward could be read as one of those traces, not the presence itself, but the place where the presence was, still vibrating at a frequency that most people never notice. Players who have described the resonance also frequently describe a discomfort that goes with it. Not a game mechanic, not a damage effect, just a feeling of unease that they associate with the sound. Whether that is the game producing a genuine low-frequency audio effect that has a measurable physiological impact, which is a real phenomenon in some acoustic environments, or whether it is the power of suggestion activating once a player has been primed to expect something unusual, is not determinable from the reports alone. The cathedral ward resonance is among the more subjective of the rumoured phenomena in Bloodborne, because it is defined by something you feel rather than something you see or clearly hear. Its evidence base is almost entirely testimonial, but the consistency of the descriptions, low frequency, from below near the cathedral, intermittent, suggests that players are describing the same experience, and that whatever is producing it in the same way each time. Chapter 9. The Hunter's Nightmare's Missing Room. The Hunter's Nightmare is a parallel dimension within the DLC that serves as a kind of twisted mirror of the main game. It contains hunters who have lost themselves entirely to the hunt, and it reflects a version of Yharnam that is permanently stuck in a nightmare state. The area is dense with environmental storytelling, and with enemy encounters that are among the DLC's most challenging. Players have mapped it extensively, and it is generally considered one of the better documented areas in Bloodborne's expanded content. But within that well-documented area, there is a specific claim that has persisted. Players report finding a room in the Hunter's Nightmare that contains a large amount of blood dregs, the specific upgrade material that is otherwise primarily obtained by invading other players' worlds. Blood dregs in this quantity would be an unusual environmental find, and several players have reported discovering a room stocked with them in a location that other players cannot subsequently verify. Blood dregs are connected to the Vile Blood Covenant and to Annalise, the Queen of the Vile Bloods. Their presence in quantity in the Hunter's Nightmare would be a lore-significant find, suggesting some connection between the nightmare and the Vile Blood faction that the game does not explicitly document. If the room exists, its contents tell a story about what the nightmare contains that has not been articulated in the game's text. The standard explanation for this report is misremembering location or misidentifying the item. Blood dregs and similar-looking items can be confused in the inventory, and the Hunter's Nightmare has enough complexity that precise location memory is unreliable. These are legitimate caveats, but the room itself is described consistently enough across multiple independent accounts that dismissing it entirely requires ignoring the convergence. Multiple players describing the same basic spatial configuration and the same unusual item concentration in the same area of the nightmare suggests either a real game element or a very consistent form of shared misremembering. The Hunter's Nightmare exists in the game's lore as a place where hunters who killed those who were not beasts, who committed the crimes the hunt was not meant for, are condemned. The connection between that crime and blood dregs, which represent the collected blood of those killed unjustly, is thematically exact. A room full of blood dregs in the Hunter's Nightmare would be saying something specific about what that place is built from. It would be saying that the nightmare is constructed from the accumulation of exactly those crimes. Whether that room is accessible to everyone, to specific players under specific conditions, or whether it exists at all in the standard game geometry is a question that has not been definitively answered. But the thematic precision of the claim, the way the described contents map onto the area's meaning, makes it feel less like a random misremembering and more like something that should be there. Chapter 10. The figure at the lamps in Bloodborne are safe points. They are where you return after dying, where you connect to the hunter's dream, where the game acknowledges your presence in the world and gives you a moment of relative stability. The lamp is supposed to be safe. Players report that sometimes it is not. The specific report involves a figure standing near the lamp when the player arrives at it. Not a boss, not an enemy, not an NPC with a purpose, a figure that has no health bar, no interaction prompt, no behavior tree. It stands near the lamp and then, when approached, is gone. This has been reported at multiple different lamps across the game, not at a single specific location. The lamp location varies across accounts. The behavior of the figure, present and then absent, does not vary. The lamp figure has been reported in the Cathedral Ward, in the Forbidden Woods, in the Nightmare of Mensis, and in a few other locations. The spread of locations makes a single source explanation less satisfying. If it were a rendering artifact specific to one lamp's geometry, you would expect it to appear at that lamp consistently. A figure that appears at multiple different lamps at different times does not fit the single geometry artifact model. The Hunter's Dream is a space that other hunters can visit. The game has multiplayer mechanics that involve phantoms, both cooperative and hostile. But phantoms have specific visual indicators. They are clearly rendered as supernatural intrusions into the game world. The figure at the lamp is described as not having those visual indicators, as looking like a solid, present entity rather than a translucent, cooperative phantom. One interpretation from the lore connects this to the idea that the lamp is not a neutral object. The lamp connects to the dream. The dream is maintained by an entity that is watching. Something that exists in the space between the dream and the waking world might reasonably appear at the connection points between them. The lamps are exactly those connection points. A figure that occupies the space near a lamp and then withdraws when approached would be consistent with a watcher that maintains a threshold presence at the points of access. Whether From Software intended this, whether the figure is a real entity with some kind of model data attached to it, or a consistent rendering behavior that produces a humanoid shape near lamp geometry, is unclear. but the figure appears often enough and at enough different locations that it has become one of the more broadly referenced anomalous experiences in the game. Chapter 11. The second version of the Doll's Lullaby. One of Bloodborne's most beloved pieces of audio is the music that plays in the hunter's dream. It is intimate and melancholic in a way that fits the dream's emotional register perfectly. Players who spend extended time in the dream, particularly on NG+ cycles, report occasionally hearing a variation of this music that is different from the standard version. Not dramatically different, but altered in specific ways that experienced players notice. The described variation involves a different instrumentation in the midsection of the piece, a more complex harmonic structure at a point where the standard version is simpler, and a continuation past the standard loop point. Players who have been listening to the dream music for years describe it as sounding like an earlier or later version of the piece, as if what they're hearing is from a different stage of the composition's development. This claim intersects with what is known about Bloodborne's music development. Multiple versions of certain pieces existed during development, and not all of them were fully removed from the game's audio files. It is possible that a variant version of the dream theme exists in the files and is occasionally triggered under specific conditions, perhaps related to a specific game state variable or a timing-based trigger that most players never reach. The emotional impact of this rumour is worth noting separately from its factual claims. The hunter's dream theme is associated with the game's central emotional relationship between the hunter and the doll, between the dreamer and the dream that contains them. A different version of that theme, appearing under unknown conditions, suggests that the relationship has a dimension that the standard version does not capture. A version of the dream that is different from the one you usually inhabit. Players who describe hearing the variation also frequently describe the doll behaving differently during the same session. Not dramatically, but slightly more responsive, slightly more present than her standard demeanour suggests. Whether this is a connected phenomenon or a product of the player's heightened attention during an unusual experience is impossible to determine from the reports. The musical variation claim has been tested by players who have recorded audio across extended dream sessions. None of them has captured footage of a clearly non-standard version of the theme. But the people who report hearing it consistently describe it as something they noticed immediately, as something qualitatively different enough to register consciously rather than simply blending into the background. Bloodborne's music is layered in ways that are not fully visible from a listener's perspective. The adaptive audio system changes what you hear based on game state variables in ways that most players never consciously register. The variation that players describe may be a layer of the music that only activates under specific conditions that are rare enough to evade systematic testing, but real enough to have been experienced by a consistent subset of players. Chapter 12. The patient in Iosefka's clinic. Iosefka's clinic is one of the first places you encounter in Bloodborne, and it is also one of the spaces where the game's darkness is most efficiently conveyed. The clinic is where the game begins, where Iosefka's voice gives you your initial instruction, and where the full horror of what she's doing is revealed later. The space is relatively small and well documented. Players know what is in it. The specific report involves a patient, not one of the hostile transformed patients who attack you in the early game. A still one, a figure lying in one of the clinic's beds who is not hostile, who has no interaction prompt, who is simply there, apparently not dead, apparently breathing, occupying a bed in a specific room in the clinic. The figure is described as human in form, not transformed, lying in the position of a patient receiving treatment. This figure has been reported by players on first visits to the clinic and on return visits, which makes it distinct from the first playthrough specific phenomena. It has been reported in one specific room more than others, and the descriptions of its location are consistent enough to suggest that players are describing the same bed in the same room. The lore context for Iosefka's clinic is deeply relevant. Iosefka is conducting experiments on the patient she receives. The clinic is not simply a place of treatment, it is a site of transformation, where people are brought in under the pretense of safety and subjected to the same blood ministration that drives the game's central horror. A patient lying still in a bed at Iosefka's is not in a safe place. Whatever is being done to them is in process. A figure that is still but apparently alive, that has no hostile behaviour, that is simply occupying a bed, suggests someone in the early stages of Iosefka's process. Before the transformation takes full hold, before they become one of the enemies you fight, the game shows you the endpoints of this process. What the reported figure may represent is the midpoint, the moment before the transformation completes, that the game usually skips over in its level design. If this figure is a real game element, its presence is a piece of environmental storytelling that most players miss. A human being in a bed at Iosefka's clinic, still recognizably human, is a statement about what Iosefka is doing and to whom. It is more emotionally specific than the abstract horror of the fully transformed patients. It is a person, in the middle of becoming something else. Several players who report this figure also report that on return visits to the clinic, the figure is gone and the bed is empty. This would be consistent with the transformation completing between the players' visits, the patient having become one of the enemies or having been removed by Iosefka's process. An entity that is present at one point and absent later is the game's quiet way of documenting a horror that happens off-screen. The existence of this figure in the game's files has not been confirmed by anyone with direct access to the asset data. But the thematic precision of the claim, the way it fits the specific narrative function of Iosefka's clinic, makes it feel like exactly the kind of environmental detail From Software would include. Silent, readable if you're paying attention, gone before you can be certain you saw it. Chapter 13. The Voice at the End of the Nightmare of Mensis. The Nightmare of Mensis is where the game reaches its most surreal heights. The architecture is wrong in ways that are hard to articulate precisely. The enemies there are unlike anything else in the game. And the atmosphere communicates a specific kind of wrongness, the feeling of being inside something that is not a place in the conventional sense, but a state, a resonance, a mind. The specific claim here involves a voice at the end of the nightmare. Not at the boss encounter, not during a cutscene, but in the quiet moment after the area has been cleared, when the player is moving through the final sections before the transition point. Players describe a voice that seems to come from everywhere, not directional, not localized, that says something they cannot make out clearly. The voice is described as neither the deep-sea creatures' ambient vocalizations nor the crying of Murgo. It is described as distinct, as having the character of speech, as containing something that feels like words, even if the words cannot be understood. Multiple players independently use the word whispering to describe it. Murgo's wet nurse, the boss of the area, does not have a voice in the conventional sense. Murgo itself is present through its crying, the sound that defines the nightmare. But neither of these matches what players describe as the voice at the end. The described sound is separate from both. The Nightmare of Mensis is described in the lore as a place built from a ritual. It is not a location in the world. It is the artifact of an attempt to contact a Great One, a space that was constructed through the Mensis ritual and that now exists as a kind of permanent intersection between the waking world and something beyond it. A voice that speaks in that space, indistinctly, from everywhere, is consistent with what such an intersection would produce. The Great One that the ritual contacted would not speak in a way that human ears could process cleanly. What came through might be approximated as an unintelligible whispering, present throughout the space it created. Whether this voice is an audio element that From Software placed in the game, or an emergent product of the audio environment in that area, or whether players are hearing something external and attributing it to the game, is not determinable from the reports. But the thematic coherence of the claim with the lore is, as with so many of these rumours, exactly right. Something speaks in the nightmare. You cannot understand it. You are not meant to. Chapter 14. The walk cycle that has no owner. In the Healing Church workshop area, players have reported hearing footsteps when no enemy is present. Not just the ambient sounds of the area, which includes some unsettling audio, but a clear, rhythmic walk cycle, the sound of something moving across a floor. The sound is localized, coming from a specific direction, and it continues for several seconds before stopping. Unlike ambient audio, which is non-directional, this sound has spatial data attached to it. Walk cycle audio in Bloodborne is tied to entity animations. When an enemy moves, it generates footstep sounds as part of its animation data. An orphaned walk cycle, footstep sounds, without an associated visible entity, would indicate either an entity that is present but invisible, or a triggered audio event without its associated model. The Healing Church workshop is a transitional area, not heavily populated with enemies. A walk cycle in that space is noticeable precisely because the area is relatively quiet. Players who report it consistently describe it as sounding like a human walk rather than a beast or monster walk, the regular 2-beat rhythm of bipedal movement, rather than the asymmetric gait of transformed enemies. A human walk cycle in the Healing Church workshop. In an area that was used by the church for work that was done at the cost of human subjects. In a space built over a history of people being brought into the church's apparatus and not walking out as the same things they walked in as. The interpretation writes itself. Something walks in the workshop. It walks like a person, and nothing in the documented game population of that area should be making that sound. Whether this is a looping ambient audio file that includes a walk element at a specific timestamp, whether it is an invisible entity, whether it is audio from an adjacent area resolving incorrectly in the spatial calculation, the reports are consistent enough to suggest that something in the Healing Church workshop periodically produces the sound of unhurried human footsteps with no visible source. Whatever it is moving through that space. You just cannot see it. Chapter 15. The second face in the mirror of the abandoned workshop. The final rumour in this collection is the strangest. The abandoned workshop contains a mirror. It is not a prominent object, not a plot-relevant item, not something the game draws attention to, but players who specifically look at it describe seeing in the mirror's reflection something that should not be there. Not a monster, not a distortion, a face, looking back, not the player character's face, though Bloodborne does not typically show you your own character in mirrors anyway. A different face, a face that does not belong to any NPC or enemy in the game, that has no model associated with any documented character, that is simply there in the reflection for a moment before the image clears. This is the most difficult claim in this entire video to assess. It requires the most specific observation, it has the fewest corroborating reports, and it is the most easily explained by the human tendency to see faces in ambiguous visual information, which is a deeply hardwired perceptual behaviour called pareidolia. A mottled, reflective surface in a dimly lit room in a game designed to be unsettling is exactly the kind of stimulus that would trigger face perception from visual noise. But the accounts that specifically describe it as a face rather than a general impression of a human shape are worth sitting with. Several players describe it as distinct, clear, present for a moment and then gone. One player describes it as a specific expression, not neutral, not threatening, something they describe as aware. The abandoned workshop is where the dream began. It is the physical origin point of the hunter's dream, the place where Yharnam first put together the pieces that became the nightmare the hunter inhabits. If any space in Bloodborne carries residual presence, the workshop is a reasonable candidate. Whatever initiated the dream, Whatever agreed to the bargain that created it had its beginning in that room. A face in a mirror in that room, one that does not belong to any established character. Looking back at the person who has come to understand the origin of the hunt is either the game's most quietly devastating piece of environmental storytelling or a very effective pareidolia trigger. In Bloodborne's specific aesthetic register, those two things might be the same. The mirror in the abandoned workshop has been documented by players in screenshots and footage. The reflection in it is a standard environmental reflection with no obvious anomalous content in any of the captured footage. But captured footage and live play experience are not always equivalent, for technical reasons related to how rendering resolves under capture conditions versus real-time play. The visual content that appears in-game during live play is sometimes subtly different from what is captured on video due to frame timing, post-processing, and display calibration. What that means practically is that the absence of the face in documented footage does not definitively rule out that some players are seeing it during live play under specific conditions. It is a narrow gap to claim, but it is not nothing. The face in the mirror, the second occupant of the place where everything started, the thing that looks back at you from the origin of the dream. Whether it is there or not, the abandoned workshop is the place where Bloodborne's deepest question lives. Not what the great ones are, not what the hunt is for, but who made this, and whether they knew what it would become. The game does not answer that. It never will. And in that silence, in the dark of the workshop, in the glass of a mirror that reflects a room where something terrible and beautiful was first assembled, there may be a face, watching, the same way the dream always watched, the same way the hunt never really ends. Chapter 16. The Light That Moves in Old Yharnam. Old Yharnam is a place the game wants you to feel unwelcome in from the moment you arrive. The warning you receive before descending, the voice of Jura calling down from his tower, telling you to go back, is not just atmospheric texture. It is a genuine attempt by someone who has been there long enough to know what the place does to people. The burned-out district below Yharnam proper is where the church's most extreme solution to the beast plague was applied, and the mark it left is not simply architectural. Old Yharnam feels like a place that remembers what happened to it. The beasts that remain there are feral and aggressive in a way that goes beyond the standard enemy behaviour of the game. They feel territorial in a specific sense, as if they know that what was done to their district was a violence that was never answered. Within that context, the specific anomaly that gets reported from Old Yharnam involves light, not the fire that the church used during the cleansing, though the area's ambient design makes constant visual reference to burning. A different light, a small moving illumination that players describe as appearing in the darker corridors of the district, at ground level, moving with a directionality that suggests intention. Not a torch effect, not a particle system tied to any known environmental element. A light source that moves. The accounts cluster around the lower sections of Old Yharnam, the areas that are furthest from Jura's tower and closest to the sealed-off sections that the player cannot access. The light is described as small, roughly the size of a lantern, moving horizontally across a corridor or an alleyway at a walking pace. When players give chase, which several have attempted, the light disappears before they can reach it. Not fading, but cutting, the way a light source cuts when it turns a corner or passes behind an obstacle. The most detailed account of this phenomenon came from a player who was doing a low-level run specifically focused on exploration rather than combat, moving slowly through Old Yharnam's secondary paths rather than rushing through on the main route. They described watching the light for several seconds before it disappeared. They noted that its movement was consistent in speed, not erratic, not flickering. They described it as behaving the way a person carrying a lantern would behave if they were walking steadily and with purpose. Old Yharnam's law involves not just the cleansing, but the people who were there when it happened. The beast scourge in that district was severe enough that the church decided the human population was not separable from the infected population, and the entire district was burned. The people who were not beasts, who were simply residents of a neighbourhood that had become too infected to be managed by conventional means, were included in that decision. Their deaths were part of the solution. The beasts that remain in Old Yharnam, by the game's own law logic, include people who were caught in a plague they did not choose, and burned in a solution they had no voice in. A light moving through Old Yharnam, at walking pace, behaving the way a person carrying a lantern would behave, in a district that was burned while people were still in it, is not a detail that sits neutrally in the game's lore context. Whether From Software intended it or not, the visual of a small purposeful light moving through the ruins of a neighbourhood that was destroyed by deliberate fire maps onto the history of that place in a way that is almost too precise. A survivor, or the remnant of one, still moving through the streets that were once home. The technical explanation most commonly offered is that the light is a visual artifact produced by the fire particle systems that populate the area. Old Yharnam has extensive fire effects, and under specific rendering conditions, the interaction between those effects and the game's lighting calculations could theoretically produce a small, mobile illumination at ground level. This is the kind of emergent rendering behaviour that is difficult to predict and difficult to reproduce consistently. But fire particle artifacts do not typically produce movement that maintains a consistent direction and speed. They produce flickering, spreading, irregular illumination. A light that moves in a straight line at walking pace, that turns corners, that disappears as if behind geometry, does not match the behavioural profile of a fire artifact. It matches the behavioural profile of a moving light source that is attached to something. Several players who have attempted to record the phenomenon in video have found that the light does not appear in their footage even when they were certain they saw it during play. This is consistent with several of the other visual phenomena reported in Bloodborne and may indicate a rendering layer that does not survive video capture. Or it may indicate that players are constructing the phenomenon from genuine but ambiguous visual information and that the reconstruction does not survive the scrutiny of rewatching. What is consistent across the accounts is the pace and the purposefulness. Players do not describe the light as random or erratic. They describe it as moving the way something moves when it knows where it is going. In Old Yharnam, which has been abandoned and burned and left to its beasts, that kind of purposeful movement from a light source that belongs to nothing documented in the game's files is the kind of detail that stays with you. Whether Jura, who has been in Old Yharnam long enough to become its unofficial guardian, has ever seen. The light is a question the game does not answer. Whether the beasts of Old Yharnam seem aware of it is something that players who have paid attention report varied results on. One account notes that the beasts in the corridor where the light appeared seemed to avoid that particular section of the alley, staying near the walls rather than patrolling the centre where the light had been moving. Enemy avoidance behaviour in Bloodborne is not well enough documented to say with confidence whether that represents anything meaningful. But it is a detail worth filing. The district burned. Not everything that was in it stopped moving. Chapter 17. The Messenger. That doesn't match. The messengers in Bloodborne are among the game's most distinctive visual elements. The small, pale, reaching figures that populate the hunter's dream, that deliver items and fill the bath, that crowd at the lamp and hold offerings up with their many hands, are unanimously described by players as unsettling in a specific way that crosses over from unnerving into something almost endearing. They are part of the game's visual vocabulary in a way that is so consistent that players know after a short time with Bloodborne exactly what a messenger looks like, which is why the accounts that describe a messenger that does not look right are interesting. These are not reports of an unfamiliar creature being mistaken for a messenger. They are reports from players who know the messenger design well enough to notice when something is wrong with it. The deviation described across multiple accounts involves a single messenger, in the hunter's dream, that has a different posture than the others. Not dramatically different, not missing limbs or displaying different textures, just positioned differently. Standing more upright than the typical messenger's hunched form, arms at a different angle, eyes that players describe as seeming to look in a specific direction rather than the unfocused, reaching quality of standard messenger eyes. The accounts of this variant messenger describe it appearing among a group of standard messengers, close enough to the others that a player not paying close attention would not notice the difference. But players who have spent significant time in the dream and who know the messenger animations well consistently describe this figure as subtly off. One player described it as being like seeing someone you know wearing a mask of their own face. The basic shape is right, something underneath it is not. The messengers in Bloodborne's lore are connected to the same cosmic ecosystem as the Great Ones. They are servants, or perhaps aspects, of something that operates beyond normal human perception. They are described in item descriptions as worshippers, and as the only beings that respond reliably to the human need to be heard, which is a deeply unsettling framing for what appear to be affectionate and helpful creatures. The implication is that messengers are not simply friendly NPCs, but are entities with their own nature, one that human hunters interpret as benign, but that may be serving purposes the hunters do not fully understand. A messenger that stands differently, that looks in a specific direction, that has a posture that suggests awareness rather than the unfocused devotion of the standard model, could be read as a messenger in a different state, not serving in the standard way, watching, reporting, doing something other than the delivery and offering function that the others perform. The specific direction that several accounts describe this messenger as looking toward is toward the player character, not the player's camera position, which is where standard messengers often orient their reaching gestures. Toward the hunter, as if it is looking at the person rather than the camera. The distinction is subtle, but players who describe it seem confident in it, noting it as the specific thing that made them pause and look more closely. From Software's messenger design has enough variation across different messenger accessories and behaviors that a slightly different posture might be within the range of normal variation. Messengers can be dressed in different ways given different accessories, and their animations have some variety. The possibility that what players are describing is simply an accessory-equipped messenger in an unusual animation state is real. But the reports that describe a messenger with no visible accessory, with a posture that is different in a way that feels inherent rather than cosmetic, persist, and the detail about the direction of the gaze, looking at the hunter rather than performing the reaching gesture of standard messengers, is the kind of specific behavioral detail that is harder to attribute to animation variation. If there is a messenger in the hunter's dream that watches rather than reaches, that stands rather than hunches, that looks at the hunter with something that functions like attention rather than the unfocused devotion of its companions, it is doing something the others are not. And in a game where the messengers are connected to forces that have their own agenda regarding the hunter's progress through the dream, a messenger that is watching is a messenger that is reporting. What it is reporting, and to what, the game would never tell you directly. That is not how Bloodborne works. But the detail of one figure, among many, that does not quite match, that has a posture that suggests something other than service, is exactly the kind of quietly placed anomaly that From Software uses to communicate the things they are not willing to state outright. Chapter 18. The Second Staircase in Byrgenwerth. Byrgenwerth is a place defined by what it found and what that finding cost it. The college on the lake is where the entire history of the game begins institutionally, where Willem and his students first encountered the Pthumerian ruins and began extracting the blood and the knowledge that would eventually destroy everything the game depicts. By the time the hunter arrives, Byrgenwerth is abandoned. Willem sits in his chair on the balcony, no longer able to communicate in words. The spiders have taken the building, and the lake below is where the worst of what the college attempted is waiting. Players exploring Byrgenwerth describe the building as feeling larger from the inside than its exterior suggests. This is a common architectural sensation in Bloodborne's design, the buildings of Yharnam consistently violating the spatial logic that the exterior geometry implies. But Byrgenwerth is specifically described by a subset of players as containing a staircase that they cannot account for on return visits. Not a hidden staircase in the sense of a secret passage, not something tucked behind a breakable wall, a staircase in a location that is visible from the main corridor that leads upward, and that on subsequent visits to the same corridor is not there. The accounts describe the staircase as stone, consistent with the building's architecture. Several players describe it as leading to a landing that is partially visible before curving out of sight, which would put the destination above the current floor level. Byrgenwerth has a second floor, accessible through documented means, but players who report this staircase describe it as distinct from the documented route, in a different location and of a different visual character. One account is particularly detailed. The player describes entering a side corridor that branches off the main hall, finding the staircase at the corridor's end, ascending several steps before their attention was pulled away by an enemy encounter, and returning to find the corridor terminated in a wall rather than the staircase they had just partially climbed. They spent time confirming the corridor's layout, testing the wall for any interaction, and concluded that what they had seen was not in the documented geometry of that space. Byrgenwerth's lore is saturated with the idea of hidden knowledge, of things that were found and then concealed, of research that was considered too dangerous to share even among those who had dedicated their lives to finding it. Willem himself is described as having hidden his greatest discoveries from his students. The college's architecture, if it follows the same logic as its intellectual culture, might contain spaces that are deliberately concealed from anyone who does not know the specific conditions required to find them. A staircase that leads up, in a building defined by what its inhabitants found when they looked upward and outward into the cosmic, is thematically on point. Whatever was at the top of that staircase, in the accounts where players partially ascended it, was something above the level of normal Byrgenwerth. In the game's cosmological framework, height often correlates with proximity to the things the college was chasing. The staircase leads up. What is up is not documented. The possibility that this is a state-dependent architectural element, one that requires a specific game condition to render, is consistent with the other reports of conditional geometry in Bloodborne. The game has documented cases of this in other areas. Whether Byrgenwerth has a similar system in place, one that opens a passage under specific conditions and closes it when those conditions change, is not answerable from the accounts alone. But several players who describe the staircase also note that they had recently used a significant amount of insight, or had just completed a specific discovery in the game's item space. The correlation between insight-related actions and the staircase's appearance has been noted enough times in the reports to be worth flagging. Byrgenwerth is explicitly a place where looking harder at the world, accumulating the kind of perception, broadening knowledge that insight represents, is the entire project. A building that opens more of itself to people who have seen more is consistent with what Byrgenwerth was built around. Willem told his students, "We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood." The staircase, if it exists, leads to what the blood made possible, and the fact that it is not reliably there suggests that the blood's gift is conditional. You have to earn the right to climb. Chapter 19. The NPC Who Answers Back. Bloodborne's NPC population is carefully constructed. The characters you can interact with are a small, memorable set, and their dialogue is one of the game's most analysed elements. Every line from every NPC has been transcribed, discussed, and dissected. The game's writing is precise enough that a single sentence from a side character can contain lore implications that communities spend months unpacking, which is why the reports of NPCs saying things they should not be able to say are remarkable. These are not accounts from players who are unfamiliar with the game's dialogue set. They are accounts from players who know the NPC lines well enough to recognise when something is outside the documented set, and the specific form of the anomaly is not an unfamiliar NPC speaking. It is a known NPC saying something that is not in their documented dialogue. The most frequently cited instance involves the doll, which has its own chapter in this collection, and whose second voice is discussed there. But similar reports attach to other NPCs. Eileen the Crow, whose questline involves hunting other hunters, and whose dialogue is among the most precisely limited in the game, has been described by a small number of players as having responded to player actions with a line that does not appear in any documented transcript of her dialogue. The line, as best as it can be reconstructed from the accounts, involved a reference to the player character's specific path through the game rather than a general statement about the hunt. The idea of an NPC responding to the player's specific history is not foreign to From Software's design. The Soulsborne series has always been interested in the idea of NPCs who know more about the player than they should. But the specific claims here go beyond the contextual dialogue that the games openly implement. They describe NPCs acknowledging things that are not tracked by any visible game variable, referencing events that the NPC has no logical access to information about, and delivering those references in lines that do not appear in the game's documented audio. Patches the Spider has been cited in a few accounts, though his dialogue is extensive enough that misremembering a line from his documented set is more plausible there than with a character whose total line count is smaller. The Skeptical Man, the NPC whose questline involves sending him to progressively worse fates, has been described by one player as having said something specific about the hunter's record of deaths that seemed too precise to be general dialogue. That account is single source and has not been corroborated. The more substantive cluster of reports involves Gilbert, the ill man, who speaks to the player through the window near the central Yharnam lamp. Gilbert's arc is one of the quieter tragedies in the game. He is dying. He knows it. He offers what guidance he can and asks for specific things in return, and the player's relationship with him over the course of the night has a melancholic arc that concludes in the only way it can for a sick man in Yharnam. His dialogue is well documented. Players who have engaged with him across multiple playthroughs know his lines. Several players report hearing Gilbert say something that does not fit the documented dialogue, specifically something that seems to respond to an action the player took immediately before approaching him, an action that happened elsewhere in the game world and that Gilbert would have no way of knowing about. The content of the reported line varies across accounts, but the character of it is consistent, something that implies awareness of the hunter's actions in a way that Gilbert's narrative position should not allow. One possible explanation is that the game has undocumented conditional dialogue, lines that trigger based on variables the player is not aware of being tracked. From Software has implemented this kind of hidden conditional dialogue in other titles, dialogue that only triggers under very specific circumstances and that can go entire community years without being discovered. If Bloodborne's NPC dialogue tree is deeper than the documented transcript suggests, lines that respond to specific player histories could exist and could have been missed in the community's documentation. The other possible explanation is that players are misremembering or mishearing lines from the documented set, interpreting familiar dialogue as unfamiliar because of the specific context in which they hear it. This is psychologically plausible. A line that sounds different because of when you hear it can feel like a different line, even when it is not. What makes the reports interesting is the specificity of what players describe hearing. Not a slight variation in a familiar line, a line that appears to reference something specific, something the NPC should not know. In a game built around the idea that some things know more than they should, that the boundaries of perception and knowledge are not stable, an NPC who responds to something they cannot have witnessed is not just a glitch. In Bloodborne's framework, it is a specific kind of horror, the kind where you realise something has been watching that you thought was not capable of watching. Chapter 20. The Pthumerian Who Sits. The Pthumerian Labyrinth is one of Bloodborne's most extensive and least fully mapped territories. The procedurally influenced chalice dungeons that constitute the labyrinth run deeper than many players ever explore, and the fixed chalice dungeons that the game uses as its primary Pthumerian content are dense with environmental detail and with enemy types that do not appear in the main game. The Pthumerians themselves, the ancient civilization that predates Yharnam and whose blood and ritual form the foundation of everything that follows, are present in the labyrinth as both enemies and as environmental evidence. The specific report associated with the labyrinth involves a Pthumerian figure who is not hostile, not a neutral NPC in the conventional sense, not something with a dialogue prompt, but a figure of Pthumerian appearance who is sitting in a specific posture in a specific location within one of the fixed chalice dungeons. The figure sits against a wall. It does not move, it does not attack, it does not respond to the player's presence in any documented way, and when players return to the same location, it is either still there or absent, with no evident trigger for either state. The Pthumerian design in Bloodborne is distinctive enough that players who are familiar with the labyrinth's enemies can identify a Pthumerian on sight. The reported figure is described as matching the general appearance of Pthumerian enemy types, but displaying none of the hostile behaviours those enemies have. The hostile Pthumerians attack. This figure sits. One account from a player who spent significant time in the fixed chalice dungeons describes the sitting figure in considerable detail. The posture they describe is not the slumped posture of a dead enemy, which Bloodborne renders distinctly. It is an upright, seated posture, the kind that implies the figure is still in some state of wakefulness. The figure's head is described as bowed, not looking at the player. The player circled it several times, and it did not respond. The Pthumerian civilization is described in item descriptions as having found the old blood and formed a covenant with the Great Ones long before Yharnam existed. The labyrinth is the archaeological record of that civilization, its architecture preserved in the same uncanny state as everything else in Bloodborne's world. A sitting Pthumerian in the labyrinth is, by the law's logic, either a remnant of the original civilization that has not been fully extinguished, or a guardian of some kind, maintaining a vigil in the ruins of a culture that collapsed around an agreement with entities that do not care about the mortality of their partners. The location within the fixed chalice dungeons where the figure has been most frequently reported is near areas associated with specific ritual functions in the labyrinth's architecture. The labyrinth distinguishes between residential areas, ritual areas, and areas associated with the Pthumerians' interactions with the Great Ones. The sitting figure is reported in the third category more often than the others, which gives its presence a specific contextual weight. If this figure is a real game element, it represents a piece of the Pthumerian story that the game has not fully verbalized. A Pthumerian who sits in the ritual areas of the labyrinth, who does not attack, who is simply there in a posture that suggests attendance rather than hostility, is performing a function that predates the hunter's arrival by centuries. It is waiting for something, or it is present for something, and the hunter is incidental to its purpose. Whether the figure is real, Whether it appears only under specific conditions, whether it represents cut content or deliberate placement, remains unresolved. But its reported presence in a space defined by ancient ritual, in a posture that suggests ongoing attention rather than death or dormancy, is the kind of detail that the labyrinth's design philosophy seems built to contain. The Pthumerians made agreements that have not expired. Not all of them stopped keeping those agreements when the civilization ended. Chapter 21. The Window in the Research Hall. The Research Hall is one of the most disturbing areas in the Old Hunters DLC. It is a hospital in the most nightmarish sense, a place where patients were subjected to experiments that were justified by the same logic that justifies all of the game's horrors, the pursuit of a higher understanding that required lower things to be done to human beings. The patients who remain in the research hall are in various states of transformation, and the design of their enemy variants communicates the specific stages of what was done to them with a visual economy that is devastating. Players exploring the research hall describe, in a subset of accounts, a window in a specific corridor that shows an exterior view that does not match the building's architectural position. Bloodborne's windows typically show either the interior of adjacent rooms, the night sky of Yharnam, or are simply decorative, covered or too dark to see through clearly. The window reported in the research hall is described as showing an exterior that appears to be daytime, not the perpetual nightmare night of the DLC's setting, but something that looks like light from a sun. The DLC takes place entirely in night spaces. The Hunter's nightmare is explicitly a nightmare, divorced from ordinary time. The research hall exists within the nightmare. There should be no daytime visible from any window in the research hall. A window that shows daylight is showing something that should not exist within the game's established spatial and temporal logic. The accounts of this window are few, and their specific location within the research hall is described in ways that are not entirely consistent with each other, which could mean different players are reporting different windows in the same building, or that the same window appears in different locations on different visits, or that the description variance is simply the product of players trying to remember architectural details in a complex building without a map. But several accounts agree on the quality of the light, not merely a brighter than expected window, something that reads as a different kind of light entirely. Warm, directional, consistent with natural sunlight rather than the cold, high-contrast lighting of the nightmare environments. The research hall's history involves patients who were brought there, who entered a space they could not leave, whose experience of time and place became entirely defined by what was done to them inside those walls. A window that shows a different time, a different quality of light, a different world than the one the building occupies, could be read as a remnant of when the patients could still see the outside world. A visual trace of before, something that persists in the building's architecture, the way the patient's suffering persists in their transformation. Whether this is an intentional piece of environmental storytelling, a rendering artifact, or a misidentification of a particularly bright interior light source for an exterior window, the accounts describe it consistently enough in terms of what it feels like to see it. Players describe it as wrong in the specific sense that correct things do not appear in that building. The research hall is a place where everything is defined by what was done to people inside it. A window showing the outside world is a contradiction in that context, and the game, which is fluent in contradiction, may have placed it there deliberately. Chapter 22. The Sound That Follows You. Out. This is among the most unusual claims in the entire collection because it is the only one that players report persisting after they have stopped playing the game. In a specific subset of accounts, players describe hearing a sound from Bloodborne after a session has ended. Not a general impression of the game's atmosphere, which would be entirely normal after an immersive play session, but a specific and identifiable audio element from the game's soundtrack or ambient audio that they report hearing in a different context. The sound most commonly described is one of the ambient audio layers from the upper cathedral ward, which has already been discussed in the context of the choir singer. But the reports in this category describe hearing that audio, or something very like it, in their physical environment after the game is no longer running. One player describes hearing it during a period of quiet while trying to sleep. Another describes it appearing briefly while they were in a building with a high ceiling and specific acoustic properties. A third describes it while standing in a location with an ambient sound profile similar to the game's environment. The most psychologically grounded explanation for this is auditory priming. After extended exposure to a specific audio environment, the brain becomes tuned to patterns within that audio and can project them onto subsequent auditory experiences that have structural similarities. This is a well-documented phenomenon, and it is almost certainly the primary explanation for most of these reports. Playing Bloodborne for hours, especially in the upper cathedral ward with its unusual audio profile, would prime the auditory system to find those patterns in subsequent experience. But the accounts that are most difficult to account for purely through priming are the ones that describe hearing a very specific audio element, not a general impression of the game's atmosphere in an environment that does not have obvious structural similarity to the game's audio. One player describes hearing what they recognize as a specific ambient loop from the cathedral ward while sitting in a silent room. Not a room with ambient sound that the primed brain could reorganize into a familiar pattern. A quiet room where the sound appeared as if from the air. Bloodborne's audio design is built around frequencies that the designers knew would have a specific physiological effect on listeners. The game's audio director has spoken about the deliberate use of frequency range and harmonic structure to create unease. Some of the game's ambient audio operates in ranges that are below easy conscious detection, but that have measurable psychological effects. Whether any of those frequencies could produce a persistence effect, an auditory impression, that continues after the source has stopped, is not something that has been formally studied in this context. The more interesting question, from the perspective of everything this collection of rumours is circling around, is what it would mean for the game to leave a mark on perception that outlasts the play session. Bloodborne's central narrative is about things that can be seen, altering the observer in ways that cannot be undone. The Great Ones in the game's lore are entities whose contact with human perception changes the human permanently. The game's insight mechanic is a direct representation of this. Seeing more changes the world you inhabit, and you cannot unsee what insight has shown you. A game that, in some small and poorly documented way, leaves an auditory trace in the player's perception after the session ends, is enacting, at a minor and non-damaging level, the logic of its own story. The contact changes you, not catastrophically, not in any way that resembles the transformations in the game, but in the small residual sense that the things you have seen and heard leave marks on the perceptual architecture you carry forward. Whether that is intentional game design, emergent psychoacoustic phenomenon, or simply the very human tendency to carry immersive experiences past their formal conclusion. The reports of hearing Bloodborne's audio after the game has stopped occupy a strange and specific place in the collection. They are the only accounts that describe the boundary between the game world and the player's world as more permeable than expected. And in the context of Bloodborne, permeability of that particular boundary is the whole game. Chapter 23. The Lantern Room, below the Hypergean Jail. The Hypergean Jail is a place defined by captivity. It is where you end up if the Snatcher catches you, transported to a prison space that exists below and apart from Yharnam proper. The enemies there are among the game's most threatening in the early to mid sections, and the atmosphere communicates confinement in a specific and effective way. The jail is not simply a prison architecturally, it is a prison experientially. Being there feels different from being in the rest of Yharnam. Players who explore the Hypergean jail's lower sections describe a room that is not consistently accessible. The room is described as below the main prison level, accessible through a passage that several players report finding open and others report finding sealed. The consistent detail across accounts is that when the room is accessible and entered, it contains a single lantern. Not a game lamp in the fast travel sense, but an actual lantern object, sitting on the floor, lit, providing the only illumination in an otherwise dark space. The room is otherwise described as empty. No enemies, no items, no bodies, no environmental text. Just the lantern, burning, in a room that should be sealed. Several players who have found this room describe a feeling of the game resetting slightly around the experience. Not a crash or a technical anomaly, but a subjective sense that the session had changed quality. One player describes sitting in the room with the lantern for several minutes before leaving, and finding the enemies in the jail behave differently on the return path, not more aggressively, but differently in their patrol patterns, as if the player's route had been altered by their time in the room. The Hypergean jail's lore connects it to the kidnapping apparatus of old Yharnam and to the experiments being conducted on the people brought there. The jail is not simply a holding facility, it is a place where people were kept for purposes that the game implies go beyond simple imprisonment. The lower sections of the jail, below the areas that most players explore, would, by spatial logic, be the furthest from any official function and the closest to whatever the building's foundation was built on. A lantern burning in an otherwise empty room at the bottom of a prison that exists outside normal Yharnam geography is a specific and strange image. A lantern is a tool for seeing, for pushing back darkness, for persisting in a space that wants you to not be able to see. In the Hypergean jail, where visibility is already compromised and where the things that brought people there had their own reasons for keeping the space dark, a lantern burning alone in a sealed room suggests someone left it there, deliberately, intending to come back. Whether the room is a real game element, a rendering anomaly, or a collectively misremembered version of one of the jail's documented lower chambers, the lantern detail is consistent across the accounts in a way that feels meaningful. Players who independently report the room all mention the lantern. The room is otherwise empty by all accounts. The lantern is the content, and a lantern burning alone in a sealed underground room is the kind of image that Bloodborne would use to tell a story it is not willing to tell in words. Chapter 24. The Altar with the Wrong Offering. The Healing Church's Architecture. Throughout Yharnam is full of altars. The church used ritual form as the container for its research, dressing scientific experiment in the vocabulary of religious ceremony. The altars throughout the cathedral ward and the church's other territories are set dressings that communicate the aesthetic the church used to make its work palatable, to frame blood ministration as sacrament rather than as the pharmaceutical and biological intervention it actually was. Players who examine the altars throughout the cathedral ward and the healing church workshop describe them as consistently arranged with the same basic set of objects. Candles, offerings appropriate to a church setting, objects that communicate sanctity and ritual purpose without specific narrative content. This consistency is part of how the game establishes the church's visual language. The anomaly involves an altar that players describe as having an object on it that is not consistent with the standard arrangement. The object is described differently across accounts. Several describe it as a hand, a severed hand, though this detail conflicts with others who describe it as something organic but not identifiably human. One account describes an object that appeared to pulse, which would indicate a living or semi-living biological element. The altar where this is most consistently reported is in the cathedral ward, in a specific side area that most players pass through without stopping to examine the altar closely. The game does not draw attention to this altar in any way. It is environmental texture, background detail, the kind of thing that most players process as set dressing and move past. But players who stop and look closely enough at it, who move the camera to examine what is on it, in a subset of accounts report seeing something that should not be there. Not a disturbing but consistent church offering. Something specific and wrong and organic. The church's experiments involve things that the game describes elliptically, and that item descriptions flesh out in ways that are deliberately incomplete. The altars in the church's spaces were not only ceremonial, they were functional. They were the sites of specific preparations, specific applications, specific moments in the ritual process that the church used to dress up what was essentially biological experimentation on human subjects. An altar with the wrong offering, something that is neither the standard church aesthetic nor an identifiable game item, sitting in a space that is presented as background detail, is either a very specific piece of environmental storytelling that most players miss, or an artifact of the game's rendering doing something with organic-looking textures in the lighting conditions of that specific altar. The accounts do not agree on whether the anomalous object was always there and simply overlooked, or whether it appears only under specific conditions.